Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, food labels and the FDA. Dr. Peter Lurie is the president and executive director of the Center for Science in the Public Interest and a former assistant commissioner at the FDA. He talks with me about the FDA's role in food labels and a proposal to require specific labels on some foods, identifying them as high in things like saturated fat or sugar. We also talk about some changing guidelines around use of the term healthy in food packaging and marketing. Let's listen. Dr. Peter Lurie, thank you so much for joining us on Public Health on Call. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. So first of all, tell us a little bit about you and your work and what you're doing right now.
So I'm a physician, did clinical work for a short while, was an academic researcher for a short while. And most of the rest of the time, I've been a public interest physician, you can say, working for public interest groups, first one called Public Citizen, now one called Center for Science in the Public Interest, or CSPI. In between those two efforts, I was at the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, as an associate commissioner working on food, drugs, vaccines, devices, what have you. CSPI is an advocacy group that takes no money from industry and very limited money from government. And we act as a watchdog group over the agency. We try to be their partners when they're doing things that we agree with. If there's something that we don't agree with, then we will note that, of course, and occasionally even sue them in an effort to goad them to stronger action to protect consumers.
And front of package labeling. So can you give us a little bit of orientation here around what CSPI does in terms of the world of food and the FDA?
Yeah, so we work, maybe you could say, in three main areas. One is labeling, and we'll talk about that in some detail. We work a lot on food additives as well. So recently we got Red 3 taken out of the food supply. We also work on food safety, which means trying to reduce bacterial contamination of food. There are other things as well, in healthy retail, for example. But those are probably the big three, at least for the moment.
Today, we're specifically talking about this proposed front-of-package nutrition labeling with the FDA. So can you first give us the lay of the land of what is the FDA's role in food packaging?
So FDA has the authority under something called the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act of 1990 to put labels on food. And the most obvious of those is the Nutrition Facts Panel, the black and white kind of iconic label that people have come to see and that is very widely recognized. Even small children know about it at this point. And so that lays out essential elements of the nutritional content of food and allows people to make informed choices about what it is that they would wish to purchase. What we're talking about here under front of package is something a little bit different. The idea is, and there's good evidence for this, that not everybody uses the Nutrition Facts Panel as much as perhaps we would like. There's even differential use according to educational status and socioeconomic status. And so there's an idea, and this is very common all around the world, to bring the essential elements of the Nutrition Facts Panel, in effect, round to the front. I mean, a kind of a shortened version, but with two important differences. The first is that it has to be mandatory. So this is something that would be required by the government. And I'm sure we'll get into industry or some ideas about making it voluntary, which we oppose. But the idea that is now up for grabs would bring it round to the front mandatorily and have an interpretive element so that people could understand if some aspect of the food is, say, high in saturated fat, for example. So that's what it does. It brings it round to the front, makes it simpler, easier to understand, mandatory, and interpretive.
That's good because, sometimes you look at these nutrition labels, there's a lot of information on the back of them. And so you've mentioned like high in saturated fat. What's another example of kind of distilling all that complex information down into one informative thing on the front?
Yeah, well, there's really just three dimensions to it. It's sodium, saturated fat, and added sugars. And so you can be high in those or not. Otherwise, you have to go to the Nutrition Facts Panel on the side or on the back, and you have to compare the amount of that particular nutrient to the government's recommended daily value. And then you have to make a decision of whether you think that's too high or too low or what have you. That does require a lot of work and a lot of knowledge from a consumer. So the idea to bring it around the front and to add the interpretation is that the government is in effect doing the work for you.
Now, I've seen this on some labels now, but certainly not consistency. So how does this exist currently?
Yes, it's an excellent question. So when ideas of these mandatory front-to-pack labels first occurred, and this idea really comes out of South and elsewhere in Latin America, that's where a lot of the energy has been. When that idea started to bubble up, industry saw that there was a potential problem coming. And so what they did was they adopted their own voluntary approach. And so the voluntary approach is indeed on the front of package. You'll see it sometimes, facts up front it's called. But all it really does is move the self-same information that's on the side up into the front for those three nutrients, sodium, saturated fat, and added sugars. But it gives you no interpretation whatsoever. It's just the exact same information that's on the side. That's the first problem. And the second problem is that it's voluntary, which is why, as you say, you only see it some of the time. The point of the mandatory that the government is now proposing is that it would be always there and that you could rely upon it when you shopped.
Now, some of the things that I've seen is not high in saturated fat. It might say low in saturated fat. So right now, who is setting those standards and who is allowed to, because that could be a marketing point too, right?
Yeah, well, part of this is to try to stop the marketing element to it and bring a more objective scientific approach to the whole thing. There's sort of two ways of approaching this, and the government actually compared these in experimental studies in coming up with its proposal. And one way to do it would be to have those three nutrients, sodium, saturated fat, added sugars, and say whether they're high, whether they're medium, whether they're low in every case. An alternative way of doing it would be simply to list the ones that are high, because in the case of these three, high is too high. These are nutrients that you're trying to reduce, not maximize. Right? So in each case, high is really, be careful. You may not want to eat too much of this. So our group, we're willing to accept either of those two approaches. We're not willing to accept what the industry has put forth, which is, something that just parrots what's on the back of the package anyway. But between those two approaches, we have a preference for the version in which only the high ones are listed. But the government has gone the other way in its proposal and instead has a high, medium, and low for each of the three. The reason that we prefer what's called the high-end approach to this is that the best evidence suggests that if your objective is to get consumers to change their intended purchasing behavior, it's the high-end version that's more effective. Moreover, there is evidence from other countries, most notably Chile, that if you have these high-end only type warnings, not high, medium, low, just the high-end ones are listed, there's an incentive for industry to reformulate its products to get below whatever the threshold is. And there is evidence that that, in fact, has happened in Chile and that has resulted in reduced consumption of those three nutrients in that country.
If this were to go through, what foods would this apply to?
Oh, it would apply to practically all of the packaged foods that one purchases in the store. And the barnyard animal-related stuff, right, that are under USDA, no, not that, but all the rest of the processed foods that would be affected by this.
And where are we now with this proposal?
So it's just that, a proposal. It came out in the last few weeks of the Biden administration. And so what that means is that it's open for comment, right? So people are currently preparing comments, what they think of this proposal. Do they like it? Do they not? Should it change in this respect or that? And what's supposed to happen is that the government is to review all of the comments that come in and then respond to each of them, deciding whether to adopt the comments that have come in or not, and then put out a final rule, which is then the final rule. And usually there's, a few years in which the companies can come into compliance. Now, of course, there's a big question of what the incoming administration would do with this. Food industry, as I've noted, is not especially happy about this proposal. So it is possible that they'll simply withdraw the thing. But in the meantime, we've gotten further than this country has ever gotten in terms of having this front of package approach, which really is the standard for most of the rest of the world at this point.
One other thing I want to ask you about is use of the term healthy, and I'm saying that in quotation marks. This has changed a little bit. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the healthy discussion is almost the kind of opposite or the complement, if you will, of the front of package conversation that we just had. So whereas the front of pack would be mandatory if it was made final, the healthy one is really a voluntary claim. So this is, if you want to use that word healthy somewhere on your package, you can't just slap it on there, according to the FDA. You have to meet certain criteria. And then if you meet those criteria, it's up to you whether or not you actually use the label. Okay, so it's a very different thing. So, there's not really much for industry to object to in this. All they're getting here are a set of guidelines about how to use this term. At the end of the day, they can use the term or not. If they don't want to call it healthy, they can call it nutritious or some other phrase if they want. This is just simply that word healthy, including how it might arise in the name of your brand. You call it Healthy Choice or something, it would affect that as well. But the idea is that if you were to see the word healthy on a package after this goes into effect, you would know that it meant certain things, that it had certain attributes. And that's the idea.
What are those attributes?
So there's sort of two parts to what it takes to be healthy under the FDA definition. The first is that you can't be too high in the very same nutrients that were featured in front of pack. So you can't be too high in saturated fat, sodium, or added sugar. And in addition, you have to have a minimum amount of certain recommended food groups and subgroups, which are vegetables, fruits, dairy, protein, so on. And in the old days, you could be healthy, with white bread, for example. The way it was defined, it was a very different approach to this, in which you couldn't exceed the levels of certain nutrients, but also you had to have certain other nutrients like vitamin A or vitamin C and calcium. So this new approach, instead of looking at the nutrients that have to be there, it looks at the food groups that have to be there. And that's how they've done it. So it's a very different approach. It's also sort of updated to take account into things that no longer feature in the dietary guidelines to the same extent, like cholesterol and total fat. Those used to be part of the healthy definition. Now they're out. So the result is that a bunch of things that were not qualified as healthy in the past, but do now and make sense to us, that's what would take place, like nuts, salmon, those kinds of things will now qualify as healthy.
This seems much more comprehensive to me because you don't get like a standard government-issued healthy stamp that you get to put on the front label of your product. You mentioned that this affects brand names. I'm guessing this affects how people write descriptions for their food, maybe their advertising. This seems pretty big.
It's only if you want to avail yourself of the claim, right? And so a problem that a consumer will face is you go into a store and you find a package, and let's say it says healthy. Okay, then you can say, all right, well, that means something. It means it's got a bit of this food group in it, and it's not too high in these three things. Okay, so you know that. But what if you encounter a product that doesn't say healthy on it? Well, there are two possibilities. One is it isn't healthy, right? At least by this definition. Or it is healthy, but for whatever reason, the company chose not to avail itself of the claim. So in that sense, it's not as helpful, we think, as something like front of pack.
So at this point, what does the average consumer need to know about all of these conversations? When they're going to the grocery store, what do you hope that they take away from this?
Well, as far as these particular two rules, and let me digress for a second just to say that the healthy rule is actually finalized and it goes into effect, within some years. Again, assuming the Trump administration doesn't decide to revoke the entire thing, which is possible. It's not that easy to do. I'm not sure exactly why they would, because, again, it's a voluntary claim. So we're in a bit of an interregnum now, right? It's not, these things are not either final but not yet in effect, or still in the proposed rule stage. So the message to consumers is, for the moment, I suppose, unchanged in the sense that there's the information as it always was from the nutrition facts label. Generally, if you're getting more than 20% of your daily value from a given food, that's considered high in any particular nutrient. So as 2,300 is the daily amount that's recommended for sodium. So just in rough terms, 20% of that is 400 milligrams or so. If you find a product that is more than 400 milligrams, that's the kind of thing that probably would get a label if the front of pack went into effect.
We know from other conversations that processed foods are the big topic right now. It makes up a huge percentage of our diet. And so these conversations are really important. And I think it's also worth noting that there are groups like yours that are out there trying to make sure that people are as informed as possible about what they're consuming. So that sounds really important.
Well, I hope so. And this is a kind of a way of getting at the ultra-processed food conversation, because most foods that are commonly considered to be ultra-processed would be swept up with a high label in front of pack for one of the three nutrients. So it acts as a kind of proxy measure for ultra-processed. A little bit crude because it doesn't capture everything in ultra-processed, but you get a good fraction of that information just with front of pack.
Dr. Peter Lurie, thank you so much for being on Public Health on Call and talking with us about this very timely topic.
Thank you very much for having me.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.